I'd like to say my name is Janine Davidson. I'm a professor at George Mason, and I'm thrilled to be here on this panel. Thank you so much to the U.S. Institute of Peace for hosting this fabulous event. I think we're going to have a pretty vibrant debate today, or not debate, hopefully dialogue and discussion on this topic. It often turns into a debate in this crowd for some reason. On our panel today, we have Brigadier General Ed Cardone from the Combined Arms Center at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. He's a deputy director there with General Caldwell. And we have Beth Cole from the U.S. Institute of Peace. I won't go into their bios. They're all in your packet. It's been my pleasure for about the past 2 years to work with the U.S. Institute of Peace and the Combined Arms Center and the great people there to work on these issues of stabilizing fragile states and on doctrine. And we'll be talking about that today. These two organizations with this leadership here that you see today have really been the anchor for a broader civil military community of practice. This community of practitioners that have served together in the field, that have fought together in the field, that have worked together here in Washington and beyond to try to hone in on some shared principles for how to conduct these operations. And one of the ways that they do that is through what we call doctrine. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that today to sort of set the stage, but I would like to give them most of the time to speak. It's an interesting point here today that the two civilians on the panel have the PowerPoint slides, and the general is just going to speak from the heart. So I think we are sort of kind of merging our cultures here. But what I wanted to do is start off with the definition of doctrine, the official definition, and I'm going to go ahead and read this for you. According to the DoD dictionary, doctrine are fundamental principles that guide the employment of U.S. military forces in coordinated action toward a common objective. It includes terms, tactics, techniques, and procedures, and represents what is taught, believed, and advocated as what works best. The purpose of doctrine is to enhance the operational effectiveness of U.S. forces. Now, this is military doctrine. It's authoritative guidance and will be followed except when it's not, except when, in the judgment of the commander, exceptional circumstances dictate. So it's important to understand that a lot of people are sort of afraid of doctrine. You know, they don't want to put this stuff down in writing because they say everything is contextual, and as soon as we start writing these handbooks for action, it's going to tire the commander's hand. Well, that is absolutely not true. This is about having baseline guiding principles that we can agree on. And so where does it come from is a good question. Well, in this case, in both the cases you're going to hear about today, doctrine comes from practice and experience over a long period of time where people decide that these are the kinds of things that are working. It's about experience, it's about theory, it's about research, and at some point people decide they're going to put it down in writing. Now, there's two types of doctrine, actually. There's informal doctrine, which you guys may not realize, but you all have read. Books, articles, magazines, blogs, things that we think about in order to frame our practice and our thought and our theory. And then formal doctrine, which is what the government puts out, which is the formal manuals that the general has in front of him. You want to hold that up there, sir? Prop. That is the new Stability Operations Manual. Now, what is not doctrine? Doctrine is not, contrary to popular belief, not grand strategy. It doesn't say, it's not policy either. It doesn't say when, where, or why the United States of America or anybody else will engage abroad. But it just says how, when they're asked to do that, they will do that. And that's important to keep in mind. Despite, obviously, my enthusiasm for doctrine, a lot of people don't share it. The first two quotes up here by a Russian admiral and Colonel Rommel both point out the same thing, that Americans like to write a lot of doctrine, or the British, lots of people like to write a lot of doctrine, but not a lot of people follow their doctrine. And then the bottom one by Sir Michael Howard basically says that it doesn't really matter what the doctrine says. What it matters is whether they get it right in the field. Well, so how are they going to do that? So if everybody loves to hate doctrine, why do we write it anyway? Well, there's three reasons. One, the process of developing the doctrine is really, really important. And when you learn about how specifically these products were developed, especially FM 307, the process is in some ways as important, if not more important, than the product. The process brings together all these people where they can debate what they learned in the field, where they can debate what they think needs to happen next time before they have to go out and do it again. And that very process helps to get people on the same sheet of music before they get in the field. And it's also not really the case that nobody reads Doctrine. People say, oh, they write these manuals, they put them on the shelf, and the Army doesn't even publish them very many, you know. But that's really not true. The new counterinsurgency field manual, for instance, has been published by the University of Chicago, and it has millions of readers. And this manual is going to be published by the University of Michigan sometime this year as well. So you'll be able to buy it on Amazon as well, if all goes. But what's more important is that in the military itself, the doctrine is used by scenario developers and trainers for the exercises that the military does. So then it becomes sort of like one of my colleagues calls it, sort of like the Bible. Not everybody reads it, but everybody kind of knows what's in it. Now, how does that happen? Through scenario development and training and education. And finally, as one of my colleagues says, doctrine saves lives. Even if it's not quite perfect, if there are fundamental principles on which you can sort of leverage when you get into the field, that's better than having to fly around, figure things out on the fly like they had to do in Iraq, and then send teams out to make sure that people understand what the new doctrine is and what the new guiding principles are. That's actually a very dangerous process, and it does cost lives. So. I think if you aren't going to share my enthusiasm for doctrine, you can maybe at least share my enthusiasm for having a guiding framework. A lot of people like to say that all these environments are contextual and it just depends. But saying it depends doesn't always help. You know, you kind of have to have some sort of a framework, of a handrail, as we call it. And if that weren't the case, I don't think you all would be sitting in here today trying to learn something. So, what is it we're learning? What is it we're talking about today? Stability operations. Some of you have probably seen this slide. It floats around. But this particular topic, weak and failed states, you know, turning chaos into stability in complex societies and war-torn states, we've been struggling with this for a long, long time. This is not about Iraq and Afghanistan. It goes back much farther than that. Just the very terminology debate should signal that we still don't have it right. In America, we've been doing these sorts of operations for as long as we can remember, from the American frontier all the way to today in the Horn of Africa, Iraq, Afghanistan, and beyond. And they've always been controversial sorts of missions. The military's always said, yeah, we're going to do it, but we don't. It's not really our job. But then they continue to do it anyway, and they do it without a lot of doctrine. Only in the 90s did they really start doing a lot more doctrine on this, and today you see the counterinsurgency and the stability operations manual becoming much more widely read. Another thing about these types of missions, this is from the Defense Science Board study from 2004. Take a look at this graph a little bit closely. It's sort of counterintuitive to think that major combat operations are less costly in blood and treasure, or have been historically, than stability operations. And you see this is Somalia, Haiti, the Balkans, and beyond. The data for this study ends in 2004. So this does not include Iraq mostly, and it doesn't include a lot of Afghanistan, which you could also categorize in the stability operations phase. And this is the casualty. This will point out to you that these things are dangerous. They're hard, they're messy, they take a long time, but they're also dangerous. Now, this study came out in 2004, and people said, wow, you know, are they inherently protracted and bloody and costly because they're just inherently protracted, bloody, and costly? Or is it because we're not very good at them? And that's sort of an open question. But the community of practice decided that they should think about them a little bit more and that they should try to get a little bit better at them. And what you're going to hear today are two attempts to sort of put down in writing the latest thought, theory, best practices for these types of missions. And we'll start with General Cardone, who will talk about the stability operations in the U.S. Army. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Janine and Beth. And thanks to the Institute for setting up such a relevant, essential program. It's great to see some old friends here. I know some of you that that know me and looked at the bio and then looked at the title for this seminar may be questioning why I'm here, because I've never been to Afghanistan, but I have been to Iraq in 2003 and 2005, and in 2007 and 2008. I just returned in June. And we have two great documents here, the Stability Operations Manual, which came out here recently, and if you get one of those trifolds in the back, it tells you how to download it for free. And the Guiding Principles for Peace Operations. Both have been coordinated with multiple agencies and are based on our experiences since 9/11 and past operations. And I've seen the power and experienced the power of the ideas that these manuals capture. They are bigger than the operations in Iraq and Afghanistan because we've adapted and learned, and we continue to adapt and learn. I hope everyone has had a chance to read them, but if not, I encourage you to read them because they both clearly recognize and codify that stability operations or peace operations are not exclusive to the Department of Defense. It takes the whole of government to have a sustainable peace. Clearly, the passage of time and events has renewed the importance of stability operations for everyone, but we have struggled and continue to struggle with the planning, preparation, and execution. And hence the focus of these two documents: how do we integrate our efforts? Some may focus on the differences and key in on definitions, starting with the titles: stability operations or peace operations. I'd like to focus on the similarities and the tremendous synergy that these documents have. They provide a doctrine and an overarching concept to guide both the whole of government and what we call the comprehensive, which is the international, multinational, non-governmental organizations, private organizations, efforts. They provide a common language that facilitate our effective communication, planning, coordination, integration, and synchronization, all within a common framework that we can use to focus our efforts. Von Clausewitz once said, "War is not a purely military endeavor, but rather a continuation of political intercourse carried on by other means." And at its core, the principle of legitimacy impacts every aspect of stability operations from every conceivable perspective. This principle of legitimacy includes many groups: the local populace, the host nation government, neighboring states, international community, and the American government in public. And it's this quest for legitimacy that brings politics into every facet of both peace and stability operations. This political intercourse, with all of its components of national and international power, requires the holistic approach in which the military is only one tool. This means the military cannot and should not go it alone. To attain maximum effectiveness, even when the military may be in the lead for specific situations, its actions have to be part of a harmonious whole. Therefore, for the success of stability operations, it's important that the overall operation first be examined in its political light, with its integral parts of power and legitimacy. And this makes information and words, combined with actions and deeds, the main effort to win the struggle of ideas and to establish legitimacy. This has created the challenge of the strategic corporal and the strategic civilian, where the actions or words have impacts on a 24-hour information cycle with local, national, and international implications. These manuals provide the guidance and direction using the same framework to describe similar end states: safe and secure environment, the rule of law, stable governance, sustainable economy, and social well-being. Yet the lack of capacity in the whole of government has forced the military to assume roles normally reserved for other agencies. At times, the lack of education and experience within the military to execute these tasks has been expensive in terms of resources, time, and legitimacy, and in the results. Let me be clear. The military has recognized and acknowledged that stability operations are one of its core missions. We are performing our role, but in some areas, we are also performing roles normally reserved for other agencies. We can do better as a government, and these documents are a great step forward. Someone once said, "You're not going to kill or capture your way to victory." Stability and peace is not possible without a government and comprehensive approach. The challenge is how to integrate the whole of government with itself and the international partners, humanitarian organizations, and the private sector. Our capacity to conduct stability operations is not going to be fixed rapidly. The ongoing work with the Project on National Security Reform is very encouraging, but it's still at the beginning. While our organizations are still developing, such as the Civilian Response Corps, the organization, processes, and authorities are still in its initial stages. While the selection, education, and training of our people is improving every day for provincial reconstruction teams, we're still building this capacity. And while our authorizations and appropriations are ad hoc, vice programs, and while we're extremely grateful for the novel legislative provisions and authorities that have been invaluable to conduct operations such as Commander's Emergency Response Funds, Quick Reaction Funds, reward programs, and increased thresholds for simple acquisitions, it also points out how far we are from having truly adequate authorities and authorizations to conduct stability operations. And then the other laws and regulations. How do we get ID cards when not a government employee? Hiring authorities for non-governmental organizations. How to work through the insurance considerations, and the list goes on. We need an effective interagency construct for this century with an established statutory foundation to support the whole of government approach. We need then to resource all agencies to foster interagency expeditionary capacities. And then we need to implement the education and training programs required to realize the potential of this approach. Now, we're already incorporating interagency and international students into our schools. We have programs that allow military officers to serve in different agencies to allow leaders from those agencies to attend our schools. We're doing more and better foreign language training. We've incorporated interagency leaders into our training and reading exercises. We have a civil-military course design underway with the State Department that uses these documents as a baseline. We're moving forward, but it's taking a tremendous amount of energy to make small, and some would say very small, steps. We can and we must do better. These manuals are not solely focused on Iraq or Afghanistan, but on operations and activities all around the globe through the entire spectrum of peace and conflict. Stability is just not after a war, it's all-encompassing. Both documents can help better prevent war, can help better support host nation governments, can better help shape interventions, can shape the actions during conflict and facilitate post-conflict activities, and can shape our future environment. But for stability operations to work, there must be a national interest, theirs and ours, and an international interest component. It must be in the interest of the international community, or at a minimum, a significant number of important players to conduct major stability operations. We alone may not always be the answer. In fact, going alone may actually undermine our actions and sap the operation's legitimacy. We've relearned many past lessons, and we've spent a lot of money and blood. We've learned some new lessons, and we know that these operations are critical to our collective futures. These documents lay out the framework, but I would argue they lay out the framework without the resources. There's a quote I like, I'm not sure where it comes from, but it goes like this: the words are there, but do they sing? Having these documents published is one thing, but are we ready to work together with the necessary trust, collaboration, cooperation, coordination, and communication necessary to make it a reality? Is the chorus ready, and are we ready to act? And this brings me back to the beginning and my closing. Integration is the mechanics of stability operations and peacekeeping operations. It is what these manuals provide. But until now, not all of our political branches have agreed that we need to resource all of the instruments to perform these operations. All political branches must agree that this is a legitimate use of all of our instruments of power, and then we must resource, build, and employ these instruments of power accordingly for peace and stability around the world. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Well, I find that it is somewhat symbolic of our crazy world today that I come with a PowerPoint and the military does not. But I'm going to abandon my PowerPoint and only present 2 slides today. I have had the honor and the privilege for my career, the first 15 years, to work on 2 vexing challenges facing this country. First, the challenge presented by nuclear weapons, which we heard about this morning. And for the past 18 years, the challenge presented by war-torn states. What I find so troubling, 13 years after U.S. forces crossed the River Sava into Bosnia, and 7 years after we went in to Afghanistan, with the host of civilian agencies from the U.S. government, from other governments, from the UN, and the non-governmental organizations, that there is no civilian doctrine, I'm going to use that term. There is no document that brings together the experience of all of these civilians for past 3 decades now in one place. It is time that there should be civilian doctrine. We know this because before we started on this effort, we went to the UN in New York and its agencies in Geneva. We've talked to the Brits and the French and the Germans. We've talked to the African Union, the European Union, NATO, the Dutch, the Japanese. We have looked at the Afghan country frameworks, Burundi, Sierra Leone, and we know that there is no document that gives civilians a picture of what it is that we are trying to accomplish in these missions today, 3 decades after being in these missions. That is deeply and profoundly troubling. So when we ask ourselves, as an SRSG, a Special Representative the Secretary General did at USIP a year ago, what are we trying to do in Afghanistan? It is no wonder that we can't really answer that question because we don't have the roadmap, we don't have the document that is built on the experience of others. So let me talk a little bit about what we did at USIP. We went to the premier center of excellence in the U.S. military, the Army's Peacekeeping and Stability Operations Institute, who have been helping nations around the world build their own peacekeeping doctrine. We went to Dr. Janine Davidson, the doctrine expert. We went to Colonel Steve Leonard, the lead author of the Army Stability Operations Doctrine. We went to Ugo Salinas, who's written the UN Peacekeeping Guidelines, their doctrine. And we learned about it. We learned about what doctrine is. We went to doctrine school. And then we decided, because it's not a comfortable term for the civilian community, that we were going to tweak it for the civilian community. And so we went out and we said, as Janine said, there is doctrine out there in the civilian world. It exists in the toolkits, in the white papers, in the policy papers, in the official guidance of organizations as diverse as the Japanese International Cooperation Agency, the African Union, the EU, the Organization for Cooperation and Development, its Development Assistance Committee, the UN Department of Peacekeeping Operations, the UN Development Program, and on and on and on and on. It is rich. It is built on the experience of thousands of people who have gone out and done these operations. And we said, give us your documents. And for 1 year, an all-women team, I'm very proud of that. If there's some people in this audience that have contributed, please stand up. My women. We have sat and we have read 500 doctrinal documents from these organizations. We brought in 1,000, but we've only had time to read 500. And that is what this document that we are about to give to the incoming Obama administration is built on. It's built on the backs of all of these people who have gone to all of these operations and risked their life and limb to build peace. Now let me just say a bit about this document. It is not about stability operations. In fact, it's about peace operations, and that's what we've called it. As Janine pointed out, we're really confused about what we call these operations, and we have a huge number of terms for them. There is no shared terminology among all of these organizations that go into these missions. There are no shared definitions, and up until this time, there are no shared principles to guide action. But if you're the Secretary of Agriculture, before you send out one civilian expert to Afghanistan to create an alternative livelihood program, you have to understand the importance of freedom of movement. You have to understand how goods are going to get to market and who's going to protect those roads. You have to understand who's going to build those roads. You have to understand who's going to create microcredit programs and banks and protect money supplies. If you're the Secretary of Treasury, before you're sending out your famed Treasury advisors to help build a central bank, you better understand how that money supply is going to be protected from those who engage in illicit economies, organized crime, terrorists, others who want to pick off that money and use it to undermine peace. You have to understand that, but to date, the United States does not have any of that doctrine. So this doctrine is specifically for those operations where there is the presence of peacekeeping or peace enforcement forces with the myriad of other civilian agencies that are on the ground. It is not for conflict prevention. It is not for development. This doctrine is for the time that these forces enter till about a generation later. Because, folks, we understand after 3 decades that that's what it takes. It takes about a decade to be on the ground. We have built this doctrine to be focused not on tasks. There are so many good task lists that say exactly how to run an election, how to operate a checkpoint. This is about what those tasks support. What we're doing right now and scratching our head and saying, what are we trying to do? What are our end states in Afghanistan? And the audience. This doctrine, hopefully, we'll find a great publisher. I mean, the U.S. Institute of Peace will publish it, but hopefully, some Amazon will pick it up too. But this doctrine is primarily for the United States government because we don't have it and because the Obama administration needs it. It is for the Secretary of Agriculture and the decision makers that decide to deploy U.S. civilians. It is for the strategic planner that puts together the plan. It is for the trainers and the people who will help prepare those civilians who will deploy. And actually, it is for those people, both the victims of conflict and others that are going out, so they understand the full scope of these missions. This document, finally, I'm going to give some caveats because it is produced by the U.S. Institute of Peace, and we are with the Peacekeeping and Stability Operations Institute, and we are not part of the U.S. government. Our mission in life is to offer tools for others to utilize. And so it is not an official U.S. document. We hope it will be embraced by the administration. It is not intended to replace any agency's doctrinal documents or mission statements. It is built on those documents. And finally, like all doctrine, it should be a living document. It needs to be updated over time as we learn and we gather the experience of people in the field. They're the people that can teach us and help us construct doctrine. So I would like to go to our slide, because here's how we've constructed it. We have found, if you look at everybody's strategic frameworks, if you look at all of the guidance out there, that people, both the local woman who has endured a decade of conflict to the strategic planner to the decision maker, that there are really 5 major end states that we are trying to achieve in these operations. Some might call them mission components, some might call them elements, some might call them pillars, but they are the purpose-based end states that we are trying to achieve. A safe and secure environment, rule of law, stable governance, a sustainable economy, and social well-being. We then found, when we dug below all these documents, that there are necessary conditions that need to be established to reach these end states. I hope that you have that document in front of you because those conditions are described here. You need, when you have rule of law, you need to have the laws. And then you need to be able to have some ability to have law and order to enforce those laws. You need to have systems that you can hold people accountable to those laws, both the public and their leaders. You have to address the legacy of war crimes and past abuses. You need to have the ability for people to have access to justice. That means courts. That means that when a police officer goes out there, he can arrest someone and he can have a court and a humane detention or prison system that's going to be able to handle the accused so that they can receive justice. That's what we call rule of law. And finally, in the rule of law, you need citizens' participation. You need people to be informed of the law and to be to want to adhere to that law and to respect the law and to be part of making those laws. So that's an example of the conditions under rule of law. I will not elaborate on this, but this is what is in our forthcoming document. Underneath all of these conditions, what we have done is we have described the approaches based on lessons learned that we have used to establish these conditions. And when people say to me that we really don't know what we're doing, I would beg to differ. We just need to have extracted it and to put it in one place, because there is a lot that we do know. There is a lot that we don't know as well. And in this document, for the first time in any doctrine, we have put up a list of what we call mega gaps. Those are the things that we really don't know how to do. It's a call to action. It's a research agenda. We ask you to look at that, and if you're in an academic institution or if you have the ability to study, we need you to look at these mega gaps. I would just argue that last week I talked to someone coming out of Afghanistan who's running in a major academy that's training police. He has no court still in all of the provinces for the police to hand the accused or people that are detained over to any courts. I mean, that's 7 years later. So it's very important that we try to fill these gaps. We have also done, borrowing from U.S. Agency for International Development, we've highlighted major trade-offs. This is something that every decision maker needs to understand before they agree to put blood and treasure of the United States on the ground in any operation. If you empower a warlord, you may calm down a particular province in a particular place, but you may undermine the legitimacy of the government as a whole. That is a trade-off. They have to understand those trade-offs, and we have enumerated those throughout this document. Finally, we have talked about linkages. We don't know how to do this technically, but if you, as we will be wont to do, only read the rule of law section, we want there to be some kind of stop sign where you have to go and you have to read the sustainable economy section, because you really can't do your job, or you can't, as the Attorney General, deploy judges unless you understand how they're going to fit in and can deal with an illicit economy. So that is, in an essence, what this document is. I offer it to you humbly. It is still a draft. We have gone through a huge vetting process. It is still open to comment. It is still open to perfection, and it always will be, actually, but we do have to publish it soon and turn it over to the Obama administration. We have received comments and gone before major U.S. allies, the NATO, the OECD, the UN, and others, gone through the U.S. government, through all the agencies to receive comments, and are undergoing a major revision of this document at this time. But if you call me, I'll give it to you, and you can still have a chance to give us some comments on it. I really believe that beginning with the Clinton administration, when we tried to build U.S. capacity, and you'll learn about this afternoon if you go to that workshop, ending with this administration, where we have built a planning, a training system, that it's time that people be handed something that shows them all of the experience of all the people that have gone before them, so they understand what this mission is like. So I thank you, and I look forward to your comments.
Well, thank you. We have about 25 minutes for questions. I just want to highlight a couple of themes that I'm picking up. I said earlier that doctrine is neither policy nor strategy, but I think from listening to our speakers today, you can probably glean that it can and should and does inform both of those things. What I heard from the general was a kind of a cry for help. The military is doing this stuff, and they know how to do it, but they are messaging to the policy community for more resources for their civilian partners, more knowledge to fill these gaps. What I hear from Beth is that this stuff isn't new. It's not a U.S. problem. It's not a military problem. Her document is informed by people from all over the world that are also struggling with this issue and have been out in the field trying to learn. This stuff takes a long time, and it's really, really hard. And oh, by the way, based on her gaps, we don't have all the knowledge that we need, which is why this community of practice needs to continue to meet and to learn from each other. So with that, I would like to open it up for your questions. We have some people with microphones. If you want to raise your hand, I'll point to you, and we can start right over there. The gentleman. And go ahead and say your name and where you're from, please.
Hi, Michael Lund from the Wilson Center. Well, I think it's really excellent that the practice community has come up to a point where the goals are being sorted out and put into a coherent framework like this. But let me just jump a little further ahead into the complexities of what this all means and what you can do with it, and point out, and examples have been given, that some of those things are dependent on each other causally. You gave a couple examples. Some of them are in tension with each other. You also gave an example of a warlord versus legitimacy and so on. The next challenge, it seems to me, is to operationalize them in some kind of form, in some sort of mechanism in which priorities are set, sequencing is foreseen, implemented, in particular places, each of which differs in terms of the sources, drivers of conflict, whether you've got governance structures in some state of capability or not, and so on. So if you could comment on what the state of the art of creating coherent procedures, decision-making mechanisms and so on in particular countries, not just Iraq and Afghanistan, but lots of the other countries. I was in Mindanao doing an assessment of the efforts of the U.S. government in development and security to deal with insurgencies there. The mechanisms don't seem to be operating very coherently, but that seems to me, to make this useful, that seems to be necessary.
Okay, thank you. On priorities and operationalization, General, Beth? I know Beth has a lot to say on this.
Well, I think for the operational side, and I just go back to the experience I have in Iraq, when I look at the difference between 2003, 2005, 2007, 2008, I think it has been operationalized, but it's more by hard work, accident, hard lessons than by deliberate design. Now that's probably overstated, but there's a science and an art to this for every country, and I think this is where I talked about this importance of education and development as we go forward on this. But I agree that we have to operationalize this, but I think every situation is so unique that we never had an overarching framework by which to operate from to begin with. And now that we have, to me, appears to be a framework that we're all using, or we could all use, then we could actually get to this point where we could operationalize it. Because before, in the beginning, we always argued over what the definitions were, and we never got past the beginning of the document. And so therefore, nothing was ever operationalized because we couldn't agree what framework we could operate from.
Beth?
Well, the short answer is if you give me a couple $1 million, I'll game this for Afghanistan. But the longer answer, honestly, we sat for an hour and a half with the deputy chairman of NATO's military committee, Carl Eichenberry, and he said, well, let's just take this and let's just look at Afghanistan and let's just figure out where we are, where we need to go, what our priorities are, how we should sequence this stuff, and that's what we need to do. But of course, these things take money, and as Janine and the general pointed out, we're not properly resourced to do that kind of stuff. A couple $1 million is, I don't know, tenth of USIP's budget. Anyway, but we do in this document talk about sequencing. We talk about prioritization. We talk about that in terms of a concept of operations, which is not also a comfortable term for civilians, but it's time that we talked about how we do these things. And so I'd like to send this to you, and you can look at that section. But we are very cognizant that these things cannot all be done at the same time. With the resources and the time and the patience of the affected community that we have at our disposal, we have to pick and choose and sequence these properly in order to have any mission success.
In other doctrinal documents and otherwise, these similar pillars are listed in a line, and a lot of people infer that that means that that's the order in which they are done. You want to speak to that little debate a bit, Beth? You pointed it out to me earlier.
We also say in this document, and again, this is extracted from all of these other incredible work of people and institutions, but we say that you have to have security. You have to have rule of law, and you have to provide essential services to the population. Some other of these things can wait. So we do sketch out that there are indeed fundamental priorities that must be achieved in order to be able to get to a lot of these other things. But as this diagram indicates, it used to be a cylinder-like document, and we did not imply any prioritization or sequencing by it. But after we took this around the world, people said, you have sequencing here. So we've gone to this Venn diagram to show that it is all interrelated. But it is extremely important that when the peacekeeper arrives on the ground, that if he's going to pick up someone, as we saw in Iraq and with Abu Ghraib, and this detention problem, and by the way, that's a big gap, that he or she needs to be able to put that person somewhere. And that place has to be able to be a place that respects human rights and abides by human rights laws and conventions. And so there definitely are priorities.
Thank you. Another question? Right there. Microphone? Where are the microphones? Oh, okay. Well, I think we need you to talk into the mic for the record, right? For the recording. Thank you.
Thanks. Andreas Binke, University of Reading. Can I ask you about the relationship between all this and the field manuals that the Army and the Marine Corps have developed in terms of counterinsurgency? Because that doesn't seem quite to fit. The Army and the Marine Corps have, in a sense, weaponized social sciences now with the embedding of anthropologists and social science expertise in order sort of to come to the specificities of the enemy they fight. They've come up with a great idea. If you fight an enemy, know who your enemy actually is. Radical insight. But it points to an appreciation of the specificities of the, shall we say, theaters within which they operate. That's nice and fine. When I look at this, however, I see a long list of generalities where the whole specificity is all of a sudden apparently lost again. In that sense, my question is this not just sort of a usual checklist of fairly Western ideas what a proper society should look like, rather than actually something that should enable us to appreciate how these societies work from the inside? You mentioned Afghanistan. Well, Afghan legal frameworks, Afghan law and order, who defines the accountability of the leadership there? Are these our ideas we bring to the place and therefore they're doomed to fail? Or are we recognizing that we in a sense sort of have to base these efforts on the respective, shall we say, local or, well, theater realities? So what I'm skeptical about here is that this long washing list of things to check off, so to speak, this cookie cutter approach, might actually end up being horribly counterproductive because we sort of think we have the solution for them. And if we only sort of go through these things, then we'll somehow succeed and thereby, in a sense, only reproduce an error that the Army and the Marine Corps at least seem to be able to overcome. Thanks.
Well, first, the counterinsurgency manual 3-24, which you can also download off the same website, was actually the forerunner to what's been an explosion of Army doctrine in just the last 2 years. So first came another one about operations, which put stability on equal par with our warfighting, and now we have this manual here to try and get after stability operations. The big change really in counterinsurgency, in addition to know the enemy, was this whole idea it's all about the populations you're in. And a lot of that is a function of the way that we were training prior to that, which is we fight enemies and population was kind of this nebulous condition that we didn't pay a lot of attention to, whereas now that's all reversed. It's all about the population and how do you root the enemy out of the population. And I think we've captured that pretty well. But in terms of the framework, even when I went into I should say we in the soldiers went into like the roughest areas of southern Baghdad, for example, that were Al-Qaeda strongholds. Once you got the security, all of these elements existed in some way. Once the discussion became, am I going to survive till the next day, to it immediately starts changing to social well-being, how do I get connected to the government, I need a job, et cetera. But the safe and secure environment underpins this and enables all these other things to work. So there is a sequencing and a prioritization of this. But I think the struggle we're having is a lot of this, and we have growing capacity in the other agencies, but this stability operations manual recognized we can't do everything. And that's the problem that resulted as a result of some of our manuals, is that we were trying to do everything, and we just can't afford that. First off, we're not very good at some of this stuff. I mean, our idea of microeconomics is to throw a lot of money at it, which completely destroys the local economy. I've watched this 2 or 3 times just on my last tour, even despite our efforts to educate our own leaders. So,
well, I made a mistake by not recognizing my boss, Vice President of Peace and Stability Operations, Daniel Serwer, who provided a lot of the intellectual capital and support for me to undertake this project. But I will tell you that he took this framework with USIP into Mahmadiyah in what's called the Triangle of Death in southern Baghdad, and used it as a basis for a reconciliation program, an agreement, a landmark agreement among tribal leaders. And so they found that this worked very well for them. But I want to tell you that in this 500 documents that we looked at, many of them originated from the affected countries themselves. The UN Peacebuilding Support Office, their work in creating country frameworks by talking to people all throughout the countries of Burundi and Sierra Leone, came up with very, very similar wants, needs, objectives, goals, and end states of people that have been through decades of conflict. In this document, we also say that in every single case, you must culturally attune all of your goals and objectives to the local population by doing an assessment on the ground before you even go in, by talking to the local population and constructing your plan from that. And so I would submit that that people around the world really do want all of these things, and that we have footnoted, in fact, in this document where we get that from.
Thank you. And to your cultural point, the Army and the Marine Corps manual these build on each other. They're the same people who are involved in writing all these manuals. But your cultural point is a key to the debate that goes on about this doctrine. If you look at some of these things, the rule of law, wow, that was good timing. The rule of law, for instance, doesn't say what exactly kind of law. It says rule of law. And then her point about assessing the situation based on the host government and the people on the ground, that's where you shake out those other issues that you're talking about. So it's not doesn't necessarily have to be a certain westernized way. That would be policy, right? Next question, right here in the front. We have a microphone?
Thank you, John Glassman, the Northrop Grumman Corporation. You know, to monitor physical objectives on the ground, we call situation awareness for the military. We have about $28 billion of expenditures in airborne ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance for the next 7 years. Now, that's for physical objectives. Now, these are non-physical, but what I'm wondering, why can't these conditions, metrics, qualitative reporting be done on a regional, provincial, local basis and put into our overall military or intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance thing? In other words, we're spending tons of money to look at physical objectives. Why can't we introduce metrics and so forth to measure these qualitative conditions and then do plans of action, as we would do mission planning on military things, to accomplish a resolution?
Excellent question.
Wow, did someone whisper in your ear?
Yeah.
We actually have a companion effort. I don't know if Mike Jacek is here or not. Mike, It's called Measuring Progress in Conflict Environments, and it is something that we have been working with the Army Corps of Engineers on, and in fact, representatives from across the U.S. government for several years now, and it's going to come out this year as well. But we totally agree with you that we need a system of how to measure progress. I would encourage you to get in touch with Mike Jajic, but it specifically looks at and is according to this framework. So these are companion documents. Thanks for the opening to advertise that.
Question we'll take right in there, in the corner, or along the aisle there. Right? Yes, you.
For the microphone?
Yes, right behind you.
This is a question for the general. You mentioned the fact that the script is there, but the question now is resources. Maybe you could comment a bit about the willingness within the Pentagon to request this money in the budget, and what sort of reception you think such a request might get on Capitol Hill from authorizers and appropriators.
Well, I don't work in the Pentagon, but I'll tell you that Secretary Gates has been very upfront that he's been supporting other agencies receiving more funding, absolutely pushing for that, and it's essential. Some people talk before it's a matter of will. I don't think it is a matter of will. That's not my experience on the ground. There are a lot of dedicated officers of all parts of the government that I've worked with, and they're out there, but their numbers are so small in comparison. I mean, the surge that was the civilian surge that accompanied the 50,000 plus troops was like 100 civilians. That was a surge, and it took months to get it on the ground. It's because there's no capacity. It's not a question of will. There's no capacity. And I think Secretary Gates has been very forthright on this issue, and we need larger support. This kind of goes back to the metrics question. The real problem is it's hard to measure this. And whereas we in the military got this whole machine that measures stuff, and we can say we need, if you want this capability, we need X money. Normally it starts with billions. I understand that. But the point is it's very hard to measure, okay, tell me how much money you need for rule of law. I can't measure that, but I think we need X. And that has been, I think, one of the reasons why we've had struggles with funding the other agencies. And the other thing is there's not a lot of will inside of the Congress. When you look at the restrictions that are put on the monies and the authorizations, even when I traveled, the Indonesians knew more about the Leahy Amendment than I did. I had to come back and read what they were talking about when I was there, just as a 2-day program as part of Capstone, which they view as stifling their development. Now, I'm not going to agree whether it's right or wrong, but I just find it interesting that a lot of these are written so narrowly, it doesn't function well in either a stability or peace operation environment.
Yeah, just a brief comment about that. I mean, we owe a debt of gratitude to the military, both the flag officers and Secretary Gates, for going up to the Capitol Hill repeatedly and asking for the funding of civilian agencies to wage peace. And we have not been able to get that kind of money. In case, if you've noticed, all the civilian agencies are operating under what's called a continuing resolution. We have been since 2006. These wars are being fought or waged on supplemental appropriations bills. The defense appropriators have appropriately funded the Department of Defense. The people that we need to talk to are the State Department appropriators, the Foreign Operations appropriators, the guys that appropriate money for agriculture and Treasury and all these other agencies. They need to understand that they are sending out people to these very dangerous environments. They are. But they are not appropriately trained or equipped or resourced to do their missions. This is a really critical challenge facing the United States, and I hope that we do something about it this year.
Thank you. Right here in the front.
I'm Marie Moser. I work for the State Department on the Iraq desk. Thank you. I manage the Quick Response Fund. So everything you're saying, General Cardone, I echo that. I agree with you. I think that the State Department has the Stabilization and Reconstruction Office, and I think that they've been severely underfunded. They're still gearing up, and they're gearing up on a theoretical basis, with the exception of Iraq. To some extent, they're engaging in Iraq, but they're very much in a theoretical stage. And I think that Treasury and the other agencies of the government that they do have technical expertise to lend. You are absolutely correct. They're not trained, but what I would see as working, and when we're doing this at the State Department now, you know, interagency committee meetings, a lot of coordination, but that has to be institutionalized because it's only being done in the context of Iraq and Afghanistan. There isn't a standing institution where these agencies can come and say, okay, let's train with the military, let's understand what the agricultural experts need to do, what the Treasury experts need to do, and let's integrate. And we need to do that on a federal government level in order to make these missions work seamlessly. I appreciate your framework very much. To me, it looks like the end game. Yeah. I think that where you've got one of these broad categories missing, we have to substitute in some of these war-torn, substitute with the military or whatever appropriate agency might be, so that we can basically give them a prosthetic so that we can continue down this road. And I'll end there. I could go on forever. Thank you.
Were you looking for a comment on that? Okay. How about, you know, we have about 5 more minutes. What I'd like to do is take about 3 questions in batch and then let the panelists comment on those, okay? So we're going to start in the back now, way in the back. That's you. Yes, you turning around. Stand up. Thank you.
Thank you. Luigi Giovine from the World Bank. I served as country manager in Liberia between 2004 and 2007. This is a very comprehensive review. We recognize many of the documents you've read. And one question concerning decentralization. In our experience, at least in West Africa, civilian-military collaboration worked best, not only when there was will, and that has been established, but when the decision-making authority, at both the military level and the civilian, was such that the path of least resistance and opportunities could be seized on the ground. Now, in this ambitious program of interdisciplinary work under whole of government, speaking from the standpoint of the US administration, would the Institute of Peace comment on whether we have now an appropriate division of labor and of responsibility between USAID and the State Department through diplomatic representations to implement this based on the path of least resistance in each country, or whether doctrinal change will also need to be implemented at that level, in addition to having stated and summarized these principles?
Okay. Another question right up here in the yes, you turning the woman with the what color shirt is that? Red, pink. Okay, great.
Hi, I'm Jill Shankelman, formerly Institute of Peace, currently at the Wilson Center. It's a related question. In terms of passing the baton, are the basic building blocks of the structures of USG appropriately configured to deliver on these approaches?
Okay, and right here in the front. Wait for the mic, please. Thank you.
John Harbison, City University of New York, and Johns Hopkins SAIS. It would seem that this framework starts out as our framework, but in the end it has to be their framework in terms of the host country. And what I'm missing in this discussion is how you make that dimension, how it becomes their framework and ultimately their priorities.
Thank you. Okay, so we have 3 questions. Interesting that the doctrine has generated policy questions. USAID and state resources, the structure of the U.S. government, and the perspective on the host nation. Do you want to begin, General?
Okay, I'll be fairly fast.
Sure.
I'd start with doctrine before organization. If you all understand the frameworks, then you can adjust your doctrine. If you have the doctrine laid out, the frameworks that you're going to operate, then you organize accordingly. As opposed to whether we have the building blocks properly structured, I'm sort of a realist. We are where we are today. I would say, do we have what we want today? No, we don't have what we want today. Now, there's a lot of good work going on in some places, but I would argue much of it is in a ad hoc nature, by institutional nature, and so there's a lot of work to be done. And the last piece, which I think is very important, the transition from our framework to their framework, to me that's all about the most important piece, which is the education and training of host nation leaders. And if that is not an integral component of whatever we're doing here as part of it, then it will all fall apart when we leave. We didn't institutionalize what we were doing on the ground.
Yeah, I don't think that we should exaggerate the importance of this doctrine. It's not the panacea. Things have to be taken into the field, and it's kind of the cookbook, and the recipes have to be cooked with the people that live in these places. I think the first question is goes to two things. One is that this doctrine that we've produced is strategic level doctrine. It operates at the strategic level for decision makers. It's about the big goals, the big end states. I think what you're talking about is more what happens on the ground, and that we don't have civilian tactical doctrine, although the U.S. Agency for National Development and others, including the World Bank, have produced incredible documents that help people on the ground understand what does it have to do at a tactical task level. In terms of the resources, I mean, the U.S. Agency for National Development has been decimated over the last decade or so. No, it needs a huge infusion of resources, and so does the State Department. It needs to be reconfigured to do these type of missions. Some argue that we need a new agency. Congress had the appetite for it. I'm not quite sure, but if you look at the amount of money and the amount of time that we spend in trying to stabilize these places, if you agree that it is important, I would argue that it's extremely important to the national security of everyone sitting in this room. That we need to resource these things appropriately, and they're not resourced. And third is this, are we configured correctly? I think there are people working on that right now, and are looking at the current structures in the U.S. government and trying to figure out how we can put them on steroids.
I would say there's two schools of thought on the structure. There's keep the structure you have, and it's really about quantity, and that we need more of similar things that we have. We just haven't resourced them enough. And then there's a school of thought that says, no, really, nobody actually does this kind of stuff, and we need a different entity somewhere, somehow. And those are the questions that are definitely being debated right now. And on the host country, Beth, I thought you might want to, part of the conflict assessment part is inherently about assessing what's happening in that country and what the host country needs and wants, what their needs are. Is that?
Yes.
Okay, so that's what I would say about that. Well, I think we're out of time, and I'd just like to thank everyone for coming and listening to the panel today. I hope you enjoy the rest of the panels, and if we could give our speakers a round of applause. Thank you very much.